The diagnostic scanner had been running for 11 seconds, and Morath was beginning to suspect it was broken. He stood at the edge of Bay 14 in the Grand Circuit staging complex, his 6 arms folded in the precise configuration that Galactic engineers adopted when contemplating structural perfection. And he watched his scanner's display cycle through error codes he had never seen before. Not warnings, not alerts. The scanner was producing symbols that, as far as Morath could determine, represented its attempt to classify something it had no framework for, like a translator encountering a language that predated language itself. The ship in Bay 14 sat on its landing struts the way a wounded animal might settle into the dirt, unevenly, with a slight list to port, emitting a faint metallic groan from somewhere deep in its frame. Morath's triangular optical cluster, 3 sensors arranged in perfect geometry that could detect a hairline fracture at 40 meters, locked onto the vessel and refused to unlock. All 3 sensors focused simultaneously, and his peripheral processing shut down entirely. This had happened exactly once before in his career. He had been inspecting the wreckage of the Delvathorn cruiser after it broke apart in the Karathi Expanse. That had been a catastrophe. This was supposed to be a race entry. He walked the perimeter of the vessel in silence. His hexagonal plating, the geometric skin that covered his body in tessellated precision, began shifting out of alignment across his left side. Another Galactic would have looked away. It was the biological equivalent of watching someone's composure dissolve. The hull was assembled from at least 4 different vessel types. He could identify a Terrashian cargo panel welded to a Morathi Scout's lateral housing, both of which were riveted to what his scanner tentatively classified as the forward section of a decommissioned mining vessel. The structural reinforcements were steel alloy plating, held in place with industrial adhesive, and manual welds that were not even consistent in depth or bead pattern, as though the welder had been interrupted several times during the process, or possibly didn't care. His digits, 6 3-segmented fingers on each of his 6 hands, began producing a harmonic hum that his assistant Balik would later describe as deeply unpleasant. He had counted 17 violations of basic engineering principles by the time he reached the engine compartment. At that point, he stopped counting because his optical sensors were struggling to process the arrangement of components inside. An engine block salvaged from a mining vessel had been mated to a navigational thrust assembly from an entirely different manufacturer and era, bridged by a coupling that appeared to be handmade. Someone was welding underneath the ship. A shower of blue-white sparks cascaded onto the bay floor, and a pair of boots, scuffed, oil-stained human, protruded from beneath the hull. The human rolled out on a wheeled platform. She was a woman of middle years, compact and strong-shouldered, with dark hair pulled back under a bandana and grease embedded so deeply under her fingernails that it appeared permanent. She held a welding torch in one hand and a ceramic mug in the other. The mug read something in a human script that his translator rendered as "World's OK est engineer." She looked up at him, then at the ship, then back at him, and grinned. "She's beautiful, right?" Morath's translator flagged the statement as possible. Sarcasm, but assigned only 40% confidence. He stared at the human, then at the ship, then at the human again. His plating shifted further out of alignment. He walked away without speaking. He did not learn her name until later that evening. Rosa Gutierrez, chief engineer of the vessel, designated junkyard dog. He read her credentials on the registration file, searching for some explanation, some advanced degree or classified military engineering background that would make sense of what he had seen. He found a reference to a family-operated vehicle repair facility in a Terran city called Tucson, followed by 15 years of civilian spacecraft maintenance work, mostly on freight haulers and short-range transports. No formal aerospace engineering education, no precision forge certifications, no zero-gravity manufacturing experience. He cross-referenced the human team's pilot, Tomas Reyes, young, certified but unranked. No competitive racing history beyond a regional circuit on a human colony world. The rest of the crew were listed as general maintenance technicians. Their combined experience would not have qualified them for a junior apprenticeship on the Galactic service team. He read the file 3 times, his digits humming in a minor key that made Bellick leave the room. Then he pulled up the Grand Circuit's entry requirements and searched for a minimum engineering credential standard. There wasn't one. The race's organizers, like Race Marshal Delenn with her pressure shielding dilemma, had never imagined they would need one. The first stage of the Grand Circuit was the Asteroid Run, a high-speed navigation course through a dense field of tumbling rock and iron. 20 ships launched in staggered intervals. The Axiom went forth, and Morath monitored from his engineering station with the calm satisfaction of a master watching his creation perform. Every reading nominal, every system within tolerance, every bolt, every seal, every quantum-tuned harmonic of his engine operating at the mathematical peak he had designed. The junkyard dog launched 4 positions behind the Axiom, and Morath heard it, through the vacuum, through the vibration sensors that lined his monitoring station, a rattling, groaning, shuddering cacophony that sounded like a machine in the final seconds before catastrophic disassembly. A metallic shriek from the port engine, nacelle, cut through the ambient data like a scream. He pulled up the human team's telemetry broadcast. The readings were erratic, spiking and dropping in patterns that defied his models. Power fluctuations that should have triggered cascade failures simply didn't. Structural loads exceeded rated tolerance by 40% and were somehow absorbed by a hull that had no business absorbing anything. Rosa's voice crackled on the open comms channel. Easy through this next cluster, baby. She doesn't like lateral stress on the port side. A pause. The junkyard dog threaded between 2 tumbling asteroids with a margin that made Morath's optical cluster twitch. Give her more throttle now. She wants to run. The junkyard dog finished the asteroid run in 13th place out of 20. Not a threat, not a joke. Something in between that Morath had no category for. His plating was still misaligned when he returned to the Axiom's bay, and Valet pretended not to notice. Stage 2 was the gas giant descent. Ships plunged into the swirling atmosphere of Korath by R to retrieve a signal beacon from the upper cloud layer, then fought their way back to orbit through crushing pressure, corrosive gases, and heat that turned lesser shielding to slag. 3 ships failed to complete the stage. The Axiom descended like a blade. Morath's pressure shielding rated precisely for this environment, every parameter accounted for. The junkyard dog did not have pressure shielding. Morath pulled up the human ship's pre-stage inspection report filed by Race Marshal Delenn, a Veylanthi official whose career was built on regulatory precision. Her notes were unusually brief. The human vessel's atmospheric protection consisted of layered hull plating of non-standard composition. She had searched the Grand Circuit's 4,000-page rulebook for a regulation that specifically required pressure shielding to be a single unified system rather than a stack of improvised alloy layers. She had not found one. No one had ever needed to write that rule, because no one had ever imagined someone would try what Rosa Gutierrez had done. Morath stared at his scanner readout and experienced a sensation he could only describe as vertigo. Though Galvani did not suffer from vertigo, Rosa had reinforced the hull with layered plating from different alloys, stacked in alternating bands she apparently referred to as a sandwich, where the Axiom resisted atmospheric pressure with rigid perfection. The junkyard dog's hull flexed, bowed inward, deformed visibly under the gas giant's squeeze, panels shifting and seams spreading in a way that Morath's engineering instincts classified as imminent implosion. It did not implode. The different metals expanded and contracted at different rates under thermal and pressure load, creating a dynamic response that no mathematical model would have predicted, because no mathematical model would have been fed those inputs. The hull breathed absorbing force through deformation and springing back as pressure equalized. Morath ran the telemetry data 3 times, adjusting his analysis parameters, certain he was missing the moment of failure. The failure never came. It was hideous, it was terrifying, and it was something Morath would never have designed in 1,200 years of engineering, because it was technically wrong and practically brilliant in a way that made his digits produce a frequency that cracked a drinking glass on Balak's console. He caught himself doing something strange in the aftermath. He was replaying the junkyard dog's descent data, not to find the flaw, but to understand the principle. He stopped himself, deleted the analysis window, and turned back to the Axiom's readouts. 17 minutes later, he opened the file again. Stage 3. A high-speed sprint through open space. The junkyard dog was holding mid-pack position when its starboard engine failed. Catastrophically, Morath's telemetry showed the power coupling physically separating, a race-ending failure for any team in the history of the Grand Circuit. The junkyard dog dropped out of formation, tumbled briefly, and went dark. Morath noted the time and moved on. The humans were finished. 22 minutes later, the junkyard dog restarted. It limped across the finish line in last place, engines producing an asymmetric thrust pattern that should have sent it into a spiral, but somehow the pilot, the young one, Reyes, was compensating with a series of micro-corrections so intuitive they looked like instinct rather than skill. After the stage, Morath walked past the human bay. He told himself he was taking a routine route to the commissary. He was lying to himself, and his plating's continued asymmetry confirmed it. He saw what Rosa had done. She had cut a power coupling from the ship's backup water recycling system, a component rated for a fraction of engine-level current. She had wrapped it in heat-resistant material stripped from the cockpit's seat cushions. She had bridged the severed engine coupling with this improvised assembly and secured it with industrial clamps and the carbon fiber wrap that his scanner identified as a material typically used for sporting equipment. He stood there for 4 minutes. His digits produced a sound that Bellic, who was not present but heard about it later from 3 separate witnesses, described as concerning. Rosa walked past with a replacement part under one arm and her ceramic mug in the other hand. She saw him staring at the repair. Yeah, she'll need a real fix tonight. But she got us home. She patted the hull with her free hand, the gesture unself-conscious and tender, like touching the flank of a tired animal. Good girl. Morath returned to the Axiom's bay and recalibrated his starboard sensor array. It did not need recalibrating. He needed something to do with his hands. The 12-hour repair window between stages was a choreographed ritual for Galactic teams. Diagnostic sweep, component replacement where tolerances had narrowed, recalibration of every system to factory specifications, testing, retesting, and a final verification pass that Morath conducted personally, running his digits across every surface, his harmonic hum shifting through frequencies that mapped the ship's structural integrity like sonar. He walked past the human bay at the second hour and stopped. Rosa was inside the engine compartment. Not with instruments, not with scanners. She was standing with both hands pressed flat against the power housing, her eyes closed, her head tilted as though listening to something Morath couldn't detect on any sensor band. Port stabilizers got a wobble, she called out. Bearings going. Hear that? A human male, one of her crew, pressed his ear against the outer hull. Yeah, I hear it. Swap or shim? Rosa opened her eyes, considering. Shim it. She runs smoother with a little play in the joints. Too tight, and she fights you. Morath processed this information. The human was diagnosing a mechanical fault by listening to vibrations through the hull. With her body, and her prescribed repair was deliberate imprecision because she believed the machine performed better with looseness in its joints. His optical cluster had been locked on Rosa for 6 unbroken minutes. His hexagonal plating was visibly asymmetric across his entire torso now, a degree of misalignment that would have sent a younger Galactic to a medical bay. He forced himself to walk away, and his digits hummed in a key he didn't recognize, something between agitation and a question. Stage 5. The gravity well slingshot. Ships flung themselves around the edge of a neutron star, riding the gravitational gradient in a maneuver that subjected every hull to forces that could peel apart molecular bonds. 2 more ships dropped out. The Axiom executed the slingshot with the precision of a mathematical proof, every structural member holding, every system green, the ship emerging exactly as it entered, unchanged, perfect. The junkyard dog entered the gravity well, and Morath's sensors registered what appeared to be a catastrophic hull breach. The ship's silhouette was changing. Panels shifted, seams opened, sections of the hull moved relative to each other, the entire structure reconfiguring like a living thing adjusting its posture. Morath's secondary arms gripped his console so hard that he cracked the casing. Rosa had built-in deliberate flex points, sections designed to move under gravitational stress rather than hold rigid. The ship looked like it was breathing, its hull expanding and contracting in slow, organic rhythms as tidal forces washed across it. Every engineering principle Morath had spent 120 years perfecting told him he was watching a ship tear itself apart. But the junkyard dog rode the gravity well, like water over stones, flexing where the axiom would resist, yielding where other ships would shatter. It exited the slingshot with its hull slowly settling back into its original configuration, like an animal shaking off rain. Morath ran a comparative structural analysis between the junkyard dog's entry scan and its exit scan. The ship had deformed by as much as 8% in some sections during the maneuver, and every section had returned to within 1% of its original shape. Not perfect, but functional. Alive, some part of Morath's mind whispered, and he dismissed the thought immediately, and then found it waiting for him 3 seconds later, undismissed. Rosa's voice on the open channel, warm and proud. "Otta girl, knew you had it in you." On the comms, Tomas Reyes laughed. The sound was exhausted and exhilarated and utterly trusting. The laugh of a young pilot who had just ridden a breathing ship around a neutron star because his engineer told him it would hold. That trust, irrational, unearned by any data, rooted in something Morath had no sensor for, was perhaps the most alien thing he had encountered in the entire race. Morath's secondary pair of hands was trembling. He pressed them flat against his console and held them there until they stopped, and he made a decision that cost him more professional pride than any engineering failure ever could. He went to talk to her. He found her in the junkyard dog's bay, sitting on a cargo crate with her boots propped on a coolant canister. She was eating something from a foil wrapper and drinking from the ceramic mug that seemed permanently grafted to her hand. Two of her crew were arguing amiably about something near the port engine, and a third was asleep in a folding chair with a hat over his face. The human team's repair bay looked nothing like an engineering workspace. It looked like a family's living room that happened to contain a starship. She looked up and read something in his posture, his plating, the careful way he held all 6 arms, that made her expression soften from its usual cheerful irreverence into something quieter. "You want to know how?" she said. It wasn't a question. He confirmed. She offered him coffee. He declined, explaining that silicon-based digestion was incompatible. She nodded as though this were a perfectly normal constraint and poured herself a refill from a battered thermos. The liquid was dark and smelled of combustion. Morath's chemical sensors identified it as a mild stimulant with no structural engineering applications whatsoever, which made its ubiquitous presence in Rosa's hand even more baffling. She began talking about her father, the shop in Tucson, a desert city on Earth where the heat warped metal and cracked seals if you left a vehicle sitting too long. The family couldn't afford new parts, so every repair was an active invention. Her father taught her to put her hands on an engine and feel its rhythm before she ever consulted the manual. "Listen first," he used to say. "The machine will tell you what it needs if you shut up long enough to hear it." How she learned that machines weren't specifications on a datasheet. They were personalities. Every engine had preferences, tolerances, quirks that no schematic would ever capture. You learned them by spending time, by listening, by developing a relationship. She told him about the first ship she'd ever worked on. A freight hauler called the Maria Elena, named after her grandmother. The ship was old when Rosa got her hands on it and ancient by the time she was done. She'd kept it flying for 11 years past its rated service life. Not because she couldn't afford a new ship, but because by then the Maria Elena was family. "You don't scrap family," she said, and something in her tone made Morath's chemical sensors detect a shift in her skin moisture that his database associated with suppressed human emotion. "The junkyard dog isn't fast," she said, her voice steadying. "She isn't strong. She isn't pretty, and don't tell her I said that, but I know every sound she makes, every vibration, every complaint. I know when to push and when to ease off. I know what she can do that the specs say she can't, and I know what the specs say she can do, but she actually hates doing." Morath found himself leaning forward, his optical cluster focused not on a mechanical flaw but on Rosa's face, on the way her eyes moved when she talked about the ship. He noticed that his digit-hum had shifted without his conscious control into a listening frequency, the one he used when testing the resonance of a new alloy. He was analyzing her the way he would analyze a material, trying to determine what she was made of. He asked the question carefully, uncertain of the social implications. "You speak about this machine as if it were alive." Rosa looked at him. The humor faded from her expression, replaced by something serious and entirely sincere. "She is, to me." The bay was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere in the distance, a maintenance drone hummed through its rounds. A member of Rosa's crew walked past carrying a replacement bearing, nodded to them both, and disappeared under the junkyard dog's belly without a word. Morath became aware that his hexagonal plating, which had been shifting in and out of distressing asymmetry for days, was doing something new. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it was settling, not into its original perfect alignment, into something else. Something he didn't have a geometric term for. He thanked her and returned to his bay, and he spent an hour running diagnostics on the Axiom. The ship was, as always, flawless, and for the first time in 120 years of engineering, the word flawless felt incomplete. Stage 6. The weapons testing debris field, deactivated ordnance and shattered hull fragments from centuries of military exercises tumbling through a corridor of space that required constant evasive maneuvering. The Axiom was performing at peak capacity, Surratt's piloting threading the ship through gaps that would have scraped paint off lesser vessels, when a fragment clipped the port quarter. Minor, a glancing impact, but the fragment punctured the coolant line to the Axiom's quantum-tuned engine, and Morath felt the ship's heartbeat stutter. He was already moving, all 6 arms pulling up diagnostic panels before the damage report compiled. The coolant line was a custom component, precision grown in his own workshop from a crystal lattice alloy that maintained exact thermal properties across a range of 4,000 degrees. There was no replacement, not on the maintenance station, not on any ship in the fleet, not anywhere within 17 systems. His digits produced a sound that made Sereth physically flinch in her pilot's cradle, her own plating rippling in sympathetic distress. The Axiom was dead in space. Morath stared at the coolant leak spreading across his diagnostic display, and he felt a sensation that he realized with distant horror was helplessness. In 160 years, he had never been helpless. He had always had the correct part, the correct tool, the correct solution, because he engineered for every contingency. But he had not engineered for the contingency of needing a component that only existed in one place in the galaxy, and that place was 47 light-years behind him. Rosa's voice crackled on the inter-team channel. "Kelbani team, you guys okay over there?" Saw the hit. He did not respond. "Look," she said, her tone shifting from casual to something practical and firm. "I've got a universal coupler and some sealant that might bridge your line temporarily. Different gauge, but I can make it fit. You want a hand?" His plating shifted so far out of alignment that Veylanthi, monitoring from the maintenance station, asked if he required medical attention. The question Morath was processing was not mechanical. It was not about couplers or sealant or gauge compatibility. The question was whether he, the greatest Kelvani engineer of his generation, could allow a human to repair his ship with improvised parts and adhesive. His coolant was leaking. His engine was dying. His ship was helpless. He accepted. Rosa spacewalked to the Axiom in a suit that appeared to be held together with patches and personal determination. She carried a tool bag that clanked with loose components and hummed a tune his translator couldn't identify. She found the ruptured coolant line, examined it for approximately 6 seconds, and said a word that his translator flagged as profanity, then immediately followed it with another word that was also profanity, and then a phrase that his translator rendered as anatomically unlikely but emotionally emphatic. Then she went to work. The universal coupler was the wrong gauge. She made it fit by shaving the contact surface with a hand tool, metal curls floating away into the void, and packing the gap with thermal sealant. The sealant was rated for 2,000 degrees. The coolant line operated at 3,200. Rosa added a second layer of sealant, then wrapped the joint in reflective shielding stripped from her own suit's thermal layer, reducing her personal protection to compensate. Morath watched this on his exterior camera and felt something tighten in his thoracic cavity that he had no biological name for. She was making herself less safe to make his ship more functional. It was irrational. It was the most generous engineering decision he had ever witnessed. She called this the good enough fix. The Axiom's engine restarted. It ran 6% below optimal. The harmonic signature of the quantum-tuned assembly was off by a margin that Morath could feel in his digits like a song slightly out of key. For his entire career, that deviation would have been intolerable, a flaw to be corrected before the ship moved another meter. But the race was still running, and Rosa's patch was holding, and the engine hummed with an imperfect life that was better than perfect silence. It ran. He watched Rosa seal her toolkit and push off from the Axiom's hull with the easy confidence of someone who had done 1,000 such repairs. She waved at the Axiom's exterior camera with one gloved hand, a gesture so casual it could have been a neighbor waving across a fence, and jetted back toward the junkyard dog. And his hexagonal plating did something Velic had never seen in 40 years of working alongside him. It did not realign to perfect symmetry. It settled into a new configuration, slightly asymmetric, slightly off-true, and for the first time in Morath's life, the asymmetry didn't feel like failure. It felt like a recognition, like his body had finally encountered a truth. His mind was still processing and had adjusted accordingly. Comfortable. That was the word. His plating felt comfortable. The final stage. A long-range sprint to the finish station, threading between navigation beacons at maximum sustainable speed. The Axiom, running on Rosa's good enough fix, performed well, not perfectly. The engine's 6% deficit translated into fractionally slower acceleration out of each turn, a hesitation so subtle that only Morath could feel it, and it cost them. Third place, Morath's first non-victory in 8 consecutive Grand Circuits. Sorath said nothing, but her plating rippled in a pattern that conveyed sympathy and professional embarrassment in equal measure. Morath found, to his own surprise, that he did not mind as much as he expected to. The Axiom had finished, with a patch made of sealant and a universal coupler and a human's stubborn refusal to accept that broken meant stocked. The junkyard dog finished 11th. Not a podium result, not even close, but it finished. Every single stage. A ship that every engineer, every analyst, every racing commentator in the galaxy had agreed should not survive Stage 1, had completed all 7 stages of the most grueling race in known space. As the ship stocked at the finish station, Morath watched something unprecedented unfold. Engineers from the other teams, Kelvani and Veylanthi and Matrathi and a dozen other species, walked to the human bay, not to congratulate, to stand in the same stunned silence that Morath had experienced on inspection day and stare at a ship that had no right to exist. Rosa's crew was already underneath the junkyard dog, patching something that had cracked during the final stage. Rosa emerged from beneath the hull, grease-streaked from forehead to boots, coffee mug somehow still in hand, and found 40 alien engineers arranged around her ship in a semicircle of disbelief. She grinned. It was the same grin she had given Morath on the first day, wide and warm and entirely without pretension. On the tour, Morath visited the human bay one last time before the fleet dispersed. The junkyard dog was being loaded onto its cargo hauler, and it looked worse than when it had arrived. Dented, scorched, patched in so many places that the original hull was barely visible beneath layers of emergency repairs. The port engine nacelle was a different color than it had been at the start of the race, because the original nacelle had been replaced mid-race with a component Rosa had fabricated from spare plating, and what Morath was fairly certain was a section of ventilation duct. Rosa was doing a final check, hand on the hull, eyes closed, listening. That gesture again. That impossible, unquantifiable, deeply human gesture that contained more diagnostic information, Morath was now forced to admit, than some of his instruments. He approached her and waited. She opened her eyes. "Your engineering is wrong," he told her. His translator rendered it flatly, but his digits hummed with a complex overtone that softened the words in a way only a Kelvani would perceive. Every principle, every method, every philosophy, wrong, by Kelvani standards. Rosa raised an eyebrow. That a compliment? He paused for a long time. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I will tell you something. In 120 years of engineering, I have built perfect machines. Machines that perform exactly to specification. Machines that have never once surprised me." He stopped. His digits hummed, and the sound was neither discordant nor harmonious. It was a frequency he had never produced. Something new. Something between what he had been and what he was becoming. He said, "The Axiom has never once surprised me. And until this week, I considered that the highest praise an engineer could give." His optical cluster turned to the junkyard dog. Battered, scarred, ugly by every aesthetic standard his species possessed, impossible by every engineering standard in the known galaxy. Your ship surprised everyone, he said. Every stage. She shouldn't exist, and she refused to stop. Rosa's hand was still on the hull. She patted it, the same way she had a dozen times during the race, and her expression held something that Morath's translator could not fully parse. Pride and tenderness and exhaustion and fierce, stubborn love, all compressed into the slight curve of her mouth. Yeah, she said. She's stubborn like that. Gets it from me. Morath extended one hand, 6 geometric digits unfolding in the Kelvani gesture of professional recognition. Rosa took it. Her small human hand disappeared into his angular fingers, warm and calloused and alive in a way that precision engineering had never accounted for. He told her he would see her at next year's circuit. She smiled. Bring spare coolant lines. He made a sound. His translator rendered it as laughter. He was not entirely certain that was accurate, but it felt like what Rosa did when she laughed, something involuntary and warm that rose from a place deeper than thought. And for the first time in 160 years, Morath decided that feeling like something was close enough. He walked back to the axiom, his perfect ship, his masterwork. And as he placed his hands on its hull, he did something he had never done in 120 years of engineering. He listened.